You ruined Thanksgiving for 30 people, Sarah. Do you feel proud of yourself? That was the first thing my father screamed into the phone while I sat quietly in an airport terminal, clutching a boarding pass instead of a carving knife. For 18 years, I had been the family's unpaid caterer, the one person expected to cook a feast for 30 relatives while everyone else relaxed. But that year, I finally snapped. Before I dive deeper, let me pause and ask, have you ever been pushed into a role in your family that no one else questioned but you hated? If you know what I mean, don't forget to hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I love seeing the places these stories reach. It all started when I was 16. My mom broke her wrist 2 days before Thanksgiving, and my dad, without even looking at me, said, "Sarah can handle it." At 16, I barely knew how to manage mashed potatoes without lumps, but I pulled it off. Everyone clapped, praised me, and suddenly, what was supposed to be a one-time emergency became a lifelong job description. Every year after, no matter how many more cousins got married or kids were born, the responsibility stayed glued to me. At first, I told myself it was love, that being needed meant being valued. But the truth? They weren't valuing me. They were using me. I missed football games, conversations, even entire holidays because I was chained to the oven while everyone else drank wine and laughed in the living room. And the worst part? When they didn't complain about the turkey being too dry, they were asking for gluten-free versions, vegetarian substitutions, or telling me Aunt Marie's rolls were slightly better. I wasn't a daughter or a sister anymore. I was staff. That's why the words my dad shouted into the phone didn't sting the way he thought they would. Because for once, I wasn't exhausted in a kitchen, I wasn't crying over burnt rolls. I was sitting in front of Gate 42, waiting for a flight to Portland, finally free. And that decision, to walk away from tradition, wasn't selfish. It was survival. I wish I could tell you that first year was just a fluke, that my parents realized how unfair it was to dump the entire holiday on a 16-year-old. But no, Thanksgiving became my job. College gave me a brief escape. I could say, sorry finals, and miss a year or two. But even then, they'd call me for recipes, reminding me, Thanksgiving isn't the same without your cooking. It was never really about family togetherness. It was about my labor. When I came back home in my early 20s, the expectations grew heavier. The guest list swelled from 23 to over 30. The shopping trips doubled. Relatives brought new boyfriends or girlfriends with picky food demands. And me? I never sat down at the table until every plate was served, every dish washed. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular. My brother's wife had just gone gluten-free. She handed me a list 2 days before. Separate stuffing, separate pie, separate gravy. I stared at it and said, that doubles my work. She shrugged, it's for my health, Sarah. Don't be difficult. That was the first time I felt a spark of resentment so strong it scared me. The following year, my cousin introduced her new boyfriend, who rattled off his allergies and dislikes like I was a restaurant server. I told her, he can bring his own plate. She gasped, Sarah, don't be rude. It's Thanksgiving. Can't you just make something special for him? It was in those moments I realized something. I wasn't family anymore. I was the help. The breaking point came 3 years ago. Dad casually handed me a list of 32 people, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Some folks are bringing friends. I told them you wouldn't mind. I remember putting the paper down and saying the quietest, most dangerous words I'd ever spoken. I do mind. He blinked, confused. What's different now? You've always handled it. What was different? I was 34, bone-tired and done sacrificing holidays for people who thought my exhaustion was tradition. That year, I broke down in the pantry, crying while the turkey rested. My relatives called me stressed and told me to manage my attitude. But inside, I knew something bigger. I wasn't stressed. I was exploited. That winter, I started therapy, and in one session, my therapist asked me, what would happen if you just said no? I laughed bitterly. They'd be furious. Thanksgiving would be ruined. She leaned forward and said, what if it is ruined? Wouldn't that prove they only cared about the food, not you? Her words echoed in me for months. and by the time the next Thanksgiving rolled around, that question had grown into resolve. By the time the next November rolled around, I had rehearsed a dozen ways to quit. I told myself, cook one last meal, announce your retirement, and let them figure it out next year. But the closer Thanksgiving came, the more impossible it felt to break the chain. I slipped back into the same old rhythm: menu planning, grocery lists, juggling requests. By then, 30 people were expected again. Dad handed me the list, Mom chimed in with, "Don't forget the vegetarian options," and cousins called with their usual favorites. It felt inevitable, like gravity pulling me into the kitchen whether I wanted it or not. Still, something inside me had changed. The therapy sessions had left a mark. I could hear my therapist's voice, "What if you said no?" That question rang in my ears as I walked through the grocery store 3 days before Thanksgiving. My cart was half filled with turkeys, bags of potatoes, and canned pumpkin. I stopped in the middle of the aisle and looked down at the mound of food. Who was I doing this for? Not for me, not for joy, not for connection. I was cooking for people who would nitpick the stuffing and then walk away without washing a single dish. And right there, under the fluorescent lights of aisle 6, it hit me. I don't want to do this anymore. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't a thought. It was a declaration, solid and sharp. I left the cart exactly where it was and walked out of the store empty-handed. That night, I called my best friend from college. "What are you doing for Thanksgiving?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Flying to Portland to see my sister," she said. "Can I come with you?" There was a pause, then a laugh. "Sarah, aren't you supposed to be feeding like 50 people?" 30, I corrected, and no. Not this year. Booking that last-minute ticket was expensive, but the moment the confirmation email hit my inbox, I felt like I had purchased freedom. The confrontation came the next evening. Dad called with his usual tone of command, "Cooking starts at 4 a.m., right? Oh, and make sure to have plain pasta for Jennifer's kids. They're picky." I swallowed hard. "Actually, Dad, I won't be cooking tomorrow." Silence. Then, "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm going out of town. I'm not cooking Thanksgiving dinner this year." His voice rose instantly. "Sarah, this isn't funny. 30 people are expecting a meal. Then 30 people will have to figure something out. You can't just abandon family. It's Thanksgiving." I closed my eyes, steadying myself with the words my therapist had drilled into me. "Stay calm. Hold the line. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm refusing to be the unpaid caterer. You can order catering, make it potluck, go to a restaurant. Families across America manage without one person doing everything he tried guilt, but you're so good at it. He tried shame. Everyone's counting on you. And finally, he tried anger. How could you be so selfish?" That was the moment, the step I'd never taken before. Everyone's counting on me to sacrifice my holiday for their comfort. That's not fair, and I'm done with it. I hung up before he could respond. The phone buzzed all night with calls and texts from relatives, angry, panicked, pleading. I turned it off and placed it face down on the nightstand. At 3 a.m., instead of setting the turkey in the oven, I was in an Uber heading to the airport. By sunrise, instead of calculating cooking times, I was sipping coffee in front of Gate 42, staring out at the planes taxiing on the runway. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Thanksgiving wasn't a prison sentence. It was a choice. The guilt came in waves. I imagined my family's faces when they realized the kitchen was empty, the table bare. Part of me wanted to turn around, to fix it, to play my old role. But stronger than that, guilt was a new feeling. Freedom. Portland greeted me with cold air and open arms. My friend's sister welcomed me into a small gathering of just 8 people. Everyone brought something. Everyone pitched in. I wasn't the cook. I was a guest. I laughed. I ate food while it was still warm. I sat at the table instead of standing at the counter. It was the most relaxing Thanksgiving I'd had since I was 15. And in that quiet, with no dishes waiting, no lists hanging over my head, I realized this wasn't the end of family. It was the beginning of something healthier. When I finally turned my phone back on the Friday after Thanksgiving, it was buzzing with 47 unread messages. Some were angry, some were guilt-soaked, and a few, just a few, were quietly apologetic. The first voicemail was my father's, his voice tight with fury. "You humiliated us, Sarah." 30 people sat in our house waiting for food that never came. How could you do this to your family? Another text from my aunt read, "You ruined Thanksgiving. I hope you're proud," but buried between the accusations, one message stopped me cold. My cousin Mark had written, "I never realized how much work you did. I'm sorry we took you for granted." That single line was a crack of light in a storm. Back home, the picture pieced together through snippets of messages and gossip was chaotic. Guests arrived expecting the usual flawless feast, only to discover the kitchen was cold and empty. My parents panicked. Some relatives stormed out to find restaurants, most of which were closed. Others scavenged through my parents' pantry for whatever they could scrape together. A few ran to grocery stores buying pre-made turkey and frozen pies. The meal, if it could be called that, was a disaster, a mishmash of instant mashed potatoes, canned vegetables, and burned rolls. Grandpa complained the entire time. Children cried because there wasn't enough dessert, and instead of sitting around a beautifully set table, people picked at paper plates in frustration. For years, my family had depended on me to keep the illusion of tradition alive. Without me, the illusion shattered in a single day. Some relatives were furious, their pride wounded more than their stomachs. My mother called days later, her voice sharp. "We never asked you to do it. You chose this role. Why punish us now?" I answered carefully, "You didn't have to ask. You expected it, and I delivered for 18 years. She bristled. "But you always seemed to enjoy it." "I enjoyed being appreciated," I said. "I didn't enjoy sacrificing every holiday while everyone else relaxed." That silence on the other end of the line was the second turning point. For the first time I could feel her processing, not dismissing my words. Not everyone came around, though. A few cousins cut contact completely. To them, I was selfish, a traitor to tradition. But I realized something. People who only valued me as free labor were never really family. Others surprised me. My brother called late one night. His voice was low so his wife wouldn't hear. "Mom and Dad are furious," he admitted, "but I'm proud of you. You finally stood up for yourself." Even my teenage niece sent a text that made me laugh through tears. It was actually kind of fun figuring out dinner together, like a cooking adventure. But Uncle Dave burned the rolls, and Grandpa complained the whole time. That message, innocent and real, showed me that maybe the next generation wouldn't grow up blind to the unfairness. In the weeks that followed, conversations slowly shifted. My Aunt Linda called to apologize. "We should have helped more." It wasn't right Mark invited me to a smaller gathering, where everyone shared the work. For the first time in decades, there was room to imagine Thanksgiving as something different, something fairer. It wasn't easy with my parents. They felt embarrassed, convinced I had made them look bad, but over time, even they softened. One night, after weeks of arguments, my dad admitted, "We didn't know you felt that way." "That's the problem," I said gently. "You never asked." 3 years later, Thanksgiving looks nothing like the old days. We rotate houses now, each family bringing a dish. Whoever hosts cooks the turkey and coordinates, but no one person carries the burden alone. The meals aren't as perfect, but they're more joyful. Kids help mash potatoes. Cousins wash dishes together. We laugh at the mistakes instead of hiding them. And me? I sit at the table, fork in hand, food still warm. I tell stories. I play board games. I participate in my own holiday instead of standing apart from it. Looking back, I know my rebellion wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about saving it. By refusing to continue the cycle, I forced everyone to grow. Those who cared about me adjusted. Those who didn't faded away. And in the end, that was the greatest gift. The years that followed my Thanksgiving rebellion revealed more than I ever expected. Some relatives cut me off entirely, unwilling to forgive what they called the year Sarah abandoned us. But strangely, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt lighter, because what remained after the dust settled were the people who truly valued me. Not as a caterer, not as the family's workhorse, but as a daughter, a cousin, a human being. One conversation with my dad stands out. We were sitting on the porch months after that disastrous holiday, both nursing cups of coffee. He looked at me and sighed. "You know, I thought you enjoyed it." "I thought cooking was your gift." I met his eyes and answered softly, "It was never a gift if it cost me my joy." That was the third turning point. For the first time, he stopped seeing me as the provider of tradition and started seeing me as a person who deserved rest, laughter, and care. Now, 3 years later, our Thanksgivings are smaller, simpler, and warmer. Everyone brings something to the table, literally. One cousin handles desserts, another makes sides, and whoever hosts provides the turkey. The meals aren't perfect, but they're ours. When the stuffing turns out too salty, we laugh. When the pie crust breaks, we eat it anyway. The pressure is gone, replaced by something that feels more like family than anything we had before. Even more meaningful, my niece once said, "I like this better. Everyone helps, and it feels fair." Hearing that was worth more than all the compliments I ever got on my gravy. I still cook, but only when I want to. I bring dishes I love, and I eat them while they're warm. I join the conversations. I play with the kids. I don't just serve a holiday anymore, I live it. And in the background of all this change, another tradition began. Every other year, I fly to Portland with my friend, just like that first Thanksgiving of freedom. We explore new cities, share food with strangers who become friends, and remind ourselves that holidays can mean discovery, not just duty. Looking back, I understand now, walking away wasn't selfish. It was necessary, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop letting them use you. That single choice, boarding a plane instead of basting a turkey, saved me. It saved my holidays, and in many ways, it saved my family too. 3 years ago, I thought walking away from Thanksgiving would end my place in the family. Instead, it redefined it. The truth is, the old way wasn't sustainable. Every year I gave up my joy so others could keep their comfort. My kitchen had become a prison, my smile a mask. Leaving was the only way to break free. I still remember the exact words I told my father before I hung up that night. "Everyone's counting on me to sacrifice my holiday for their convenience. That's not fair, and I'm done with it." Those words didn't just free me, they forced everyone else to confront what they had ignored for nearly 2 decades. Some walked away, others apologized, but most importantly, I discovered who my real family was. The people who valued me as a person, not as a provider. Now our gatherings are lighter, smaller, honest. The food isn't perfect, but the laughter is real. And I've learned that a broken pie crust tastes a lot better when you eat it with people who truly care. The lesson is simple. Choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do because it teaches others how to respect your boundaries. So if you've ever felt trapped by family expectations, remember this. Tradition should never come at the cost of your peace. You deserve to sit at the table, not just serve it. And if you're listening right now, I want to know, have you ever been pushed into a role in your family that you didn't choose? Drop your story in the comments. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of stories like this. Because at the end of the day, these aren't just my experiences. They're family stories we all share, the kind that remind us that freedom, respect, and love matter more than any perfectly cooked turkey.